Welcome to Section 7, Preparing a RESTful API for Production. In this section, we will transform our API app into microservices to deploy them on Amazon Web Services. We will first document our RESTful API with OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger. Then, we will use PM2 for production process management. Then, we will Dockerize our API. Next, we will use the AWS code commit service in order to control our source code. Then, we will create an AWS identity role. Next, we will set an AWS EC2 instance, more on this later. And finally, we will deploy our app. So let's first start with documenting the RESTful API with OpenAPI. For this, we will need to install two libraries, namely Swagger UI Express and Swagger JS Doc. Next, we will create a new middleware named swagger.middleware.js. Inside this file, we will import our two libraries. Then, we will create a class named Swagger Middleware. We define a specs private property. Then our constructor will take three arguments, namely the version of our API, the servers which our API is running, and finally the different APIs that our project uses. Then we will set options for the Swagger JS Doc libraries, namely different information about our API, like the title, the version, the description, and some basic information about the OpenAPI project. Next, we will set the servers that we got from our arguments, and finally the APIs. Then we will use the import from our Swagger JS Doc and pass it the options defined above. And then we store the result of this execution inside the specs private property. Then we will define a Swagger UI handlers getter in order to get the different handlers for Swagger UI. This basically will handle when we make requests in order to display the documentation, that some processes are made in order to display the code properly. Then we will set a Swagger UI middleware, which is a getter, and then we will use the setup method from the Swagger UI import and pass it our specs defined above, and pass a configuration object with the Explorer property set to true. So this middleware will be used when accessing the endpoint in order to show the documentation. Next, inside this folder, we will also define an index.js file. Here, we import our Swagger middleware and create a new instance. Then we pass the version of our API. Then we pass the servers which our API is running. Here only one server. And then we pass the APIs that our API is using. So basically, this will be the path from our current project folder in which we can find the different OpenAPI specifications. I encourage you to read the OpenAPI documentation for more information about this. Then we set an express router. Then we will use the use method in order to apply the Swagger UI handlers to all endpoints on the root path. Then we set get request handler for the root path and use the Swagger UI middleware in order to be able to display our HTML page with the different info about our endpoint. And finally, we export our router. Then don't forget to import it in server.js as so, and pass it to the router's property of our configuration object. Next, we will create a contact.schema.yaml file. This will describe a contact. Then again, look at the OpenAPI documentation to exactly understand how to set this YAML file. Finally, we will set a contacts v2.yaml file which will describe our different endpoints. For this, we will set a path node and then describe the endpoint. Next, we will define the different methods on this /contacts endpoint. Let's have a look. Here, we will set the GET request. We will describe what it does. Then we define the different parameters which can be passed when doing this request. And then we define the different responses according to the status. Here you can see the success case and next the error cases. Then again, look at the OpenAPI documentation for way more details. Here, this is just an overview. Next, with the post method, it is similar logic, but we can also use a request body. Now, make sure your server is running. Next, open a browser and then go to the /API/docs/v2 address, and you will be able to see the generated documentation. As you can see here, our YAML files were converted to this page. And here we can see the different endpoints that we have set and what parameters they get. And also we can see the response and what type of data structure is returned. Also for the post request, similar logic, and here the request body and the response. And finally, we can see the different schemas. Here, the schema for a contact. So all this was generated thanks to our Swagger UI library and the configuration passed to Swagger.js doc. You can get more information by going to this link.